Perfect. So why don't you start from that end, and then we'll say something from this end, and then we can begin the presentation.
Sure. So, well, first of all, I'd like to say that it's a great pleasure to be in this video conference with the UCHV and people at Princeton. I want to welcome everybody here at CIDE. It is a great pleasure to welcome Luis Enrique Camacho, an expert in the philosophy and the ethics of immigration, and Javier Treviño, who's also an expert more in the empirical study of migration processes from Mexico to the US. I want to thank the Division of International Studies here at CIDE and the Division of Political Studies for hosting us. And it's great to be in touch with you guys in this event. So we're ready to go.
Wonderful. Well, we're also delighted to be collaborating with you in this experimental format here at Princeton with the University Center for Human Values and other colleagues from the Department of Politics and from the Woodrow Wilson School and Department of Sociology and Public Affairs at Princeton. As some of you know, one of our scheduled panelists, Linda Bosniak, is not able, due to an emergency today, to participate, but we're delighted to have with us instead Francisco Garcia Gibson, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Philosophical Research in Buenos Aires and is visiting the politics department at Princeton this semester. And our other scheduled panelist, Professor Doug Massey, the Henry G. Bryant Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs, also in the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University, whose expertise is in international migration and related topics. I think, why don't we proceed with the presentations from the panelists in the order that they're listed on the program, and then we will continue with conversation among the panel, and then with the audiences in both locations.
Sounds good. I don't have the program with me right now, so I don't know who's
I believe that Enrique Camacho was going to begin.
Okay, I go first.
Just speak up so that everybody can hear.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm very pleased to participate in this process, in this experiment, as you say. I'm going to focus in the few minutes that I have in the case of Mexican children traveling alone through the border. I think the perplexity that I find is that most of the time these kind of problems are analyzed with a very constrained view about our duties, a very monastic view about our duties that recognizes only duties coming from consent. And the hope is that if we approach these kind of issues from a more complete and complex view of our duties that can accommodate, for instance, associative role duties, maybe we could ground a good case for asylum or refuge to these children, or even to displaced migrants because of violence, as Claudio is interested in that subject as well. I think the two pressing problems share the same kind of moral ground. Obviously, I have to start with my core moral assumption in the hope that this is not very controversial. I think that all liberal democracies have a moral character, meaning that they share certain kind of moral values. And that's important to me because it's the kind of assumption that people who defend border restrictions share with me. So that kind of assumption allows us to have a conversation. And from that kind of view, the defender of border restrictions think that states are responsible in the idea that worse-off states are also responsible culturally and historically about their situation. And also, if states have moral status, they also have moral rights. in the sense that they have a moral right to not associate with people that they don't like to be associated with. This, I think, Javier maybe is gonna, or someone else is gonna, or Francisco is gonna speak more about these issues. So I'm just saying that these kind of arguments are weak because they are prima facie arguments that are subject to many other considerations. And crucially, these arguments never speak about territory. So territorial border restrictions need that we have a good justification about not allowing people inside the territory. But more recently, there is Michael Blake, who has advanced another kind of argument. He claims that it maybe it's not true that states are like clubs and families in the way that they have this kind of powerful association of rights. Maybe states, the people within the states have a moral right not to get engaged in legal obligations that they don't want to share. And I think that this argument is very interesting. The problem that I find with this argument is that I believe that Michael Blake conflates the kind of legitimacy coming from law from the kind of legitimacy coming from the state. So the function, the purpose of the law is to establish legal duties, whereas the purpose of states is protecting rights, and that's a different kind of story. So if you argue that legal obligations, legal duties run in certain way rights, exclusionary rights, you don't realize that jurisdiction doesn't need territorial exclusion. The only thing that legal jurisdiction demands is obedience. So it doesn't matter that if you are in the territory, the only thing that the law requires from you is obedience, not territorial exclusion. But in any case, I think that Michael Blake is persuasive in the sense that we might have legal and moral obligations that we need to deal with. And I think that what Michael Blake doesn't realize either is that not all our obligations or duties come from consent to get engaged in legal or moral obligations, but many of our duties come from being involved in certain relationships. So, for instance, I was a very spoiled and mean child, and when my mom told me to do errands and chores, I said that I was not under any obligation because I was not, I didn't ask to be born. And my mother obviously was very upset about that and thought that I was very idiotic. And my mother was right, and not all our duties come from consent, but to be engaged in certain roles. And I think here in North America, between Canada, United States, and Mexico, we have a cooperative community of certain kind, within which all states involved in that kind of relationship play certain roles. So I think Michael Blake is right to claim that if one political community doesn't want to be engaged in certain legal duties, they have the right to not be engaged in these duties, but they have to act on it. They have to withdraw from the cooperative relationships. They have to withdraw from benefit from international, diplomatic, and financial, commercial relationships. And I think this applies to the case of children traveling alone, Because in that case, the general duty not to harm that grounds the obligation to protect children human rights while allowing them to deport them back to their places of origin gets particularized and strengthened in the same sense, and I finish with this, that you may have not only a permission or a moral obligation to rescue a child in a place in fire, that is your niece, for instance. If you cannot rescue the two children at the same time, you may have a permission and even a moral obligation to rescue the one with whom you have a special relationship. And I think, that's my alarm, I'm sorry. I think if your main business partner, your neighbor, and your friend have children in distress, traveling alone, you have a special duty to make them stay home if you can. I'm going to stop there. Thank you
very much. Thank you very much. And I think it's very helpful to have begun with these normative questions. And our second panelist will also be addressing the broad normative framework. And then our latter two panelists, I think, will be speaking about concrete questions as you also began to open about the immigration between the U.S. and Mexico. So our second panelist is Francisco Garcia Gibson.
This panel, so I also like to make.
We can't hear him very well.
Why don't you move up?
Should we switch?
Eso es que no solo pasa en el CIDE.
I would like to make some general remarks on how to limit the argument for closed borders. Okay, so I believe that most arguments for closed borders share the same kind of shortcomings. I believe that even if we concede very questionable empirical premises on which they are based, and even if we concede most of their normative premises, they are insufficient to show that states have a right to fully restrict immigration. So the problem is that these arguments are based on rights. Okay, I will just review the three that I believe are most compelling arguments for restricting immigration. The first argument is based on the welfare state and the fact that in order to protect the rights that the welfare state protects, it might be important to limit immigration because especially massive immigration might cause a collapse of the services that are provided by the local state, such as health services. Okay, at least initially, the state, if there's massive immigration, it would be unable to provide the services to all immigrants and citizens that were living there before. And also another argument related to the welfare state is that the welfare state needs support to the citizens, moral support and economic support, and support requires motivation, and motivation requires identification with your co-citizens, and the argument says that, well, you're not as able to identify, you don't identify as easily with immigrants as with non-immigrants. So that's one argument for grounding your right to restrict immigration. Another argument is the one by Michael Blake that Enrique mentioned, the idea that I have a right to choose with whom I have obligations, especially human rights obligations, and a restricted right to migrate implies that I might acquire obligations with whomever decides to live in my country. So that's another argument. And the other argument is the idea that less skilled workers, for instance, here in America, have a right not to face competition by immigrants because, well, these people, the less skilled workers here are the worst off here. So there's an egalitarian argument for restricting immigration, meaning that saying that if you allow immigrants to come in, then these people will be even worse off. So from a prioritarian perspective, we should not allow immigration. So these are the arguments, and these arguments try to show that there is a right to restrict immigration. And I believe that even if we concede the point that there are rights here, rights are involved, and if we understand rights in the standard way, which is that they trump non-rights consideration, okay? Even if we concede that, we should notice that the people that defend open borders also argue for rights. Okay, they say that immigrants have, for instance, rights to freedom of movement, rights to freedom from poverty. Okay, and I believe that they show that these rights exist, and restricting immigration will restrict these rights. So I think that the picture that we're facing is a case of conflict between rights. And when rights conflict, it is not clear that they trump each other. So the situation when you have a conflict between a right and some other kind of consideration, such as the welfare consideration, is one thing, and another thing is when you have two rights in conflict. And when two rights conflict, I think that the right way to solve the conflict, the normatively defensible way to solve this conflict, is not in a kind of lexical absolute priority or trumping kind of priority, but a proportional priority. Okay, so this means that each right should be satisfied to a partial way. Okay, according to each right's weight. We should weight each right, see whether they are equally weighty or whether one is weightier than the other one, and we should try to accommodate or comply with the rights or respect the rights to the extent that, in proportion to the relative weight. Okay. Since there is a conflict, we won't be able to satisfy them fully, each of them fully, but we should satisfy each right, at least partially. So what this implies is basically that arguments that try to argue that there is a right to restrict borders are unable to show that there is a right to fully restrict borders. So I'd like to end with that.
Thank you very much. Continue in order. Our next speaker is Doug Massey here in Princeton.
Sure, I guess so. Musical chairs. I'm not a philosopher or an ethicist. I'm a social scientist, and my views on Mexican immigration to the United States and immigration more generally to the United States come from my historical understanding of immigration processes in the Western Hemisphere and my social scientific understanding of the current situation and how we got here. And I'm very critical of American immigration and border policies because I think they are dysfunctional, counterproductive, and unethical. They're dysfunctional because they, at the core of what we're doing in North America now lies a contradiction, and that is we are committed in North America and now in Central America as well to creating an integrated North American economy with lowering the barriers to free movement of goods, capital, information, services. But magically, within the integrated North American economy we're creating under NAFTA, and CAFTA, we magically want to prevent the integration of labor markets, which is a basic contradiction because everything that happens in the course of market integration brings people into contact with one another and promotes the movement of people. We can see this in the legal immigration statistics, massive increases in legal movements back and forth across the border with various kinds of temporary visas in addition to permanent visas, but somehow we don't want to admit that we're going to integrate our labor markets. And by finessing this contradiction, we create serious problems. It's counterproductive because, in particular in the case of Mexico and the United States, it builds on really almost 100 years of migratory tradition with only a small gap during the Depression years. And in fact, the current wave of immigrants to the United States began with U.S. recruitment efforts during the Bracero program from 1942 to 1964. So we actually jump-started the process of migration to the United States. And then in 1965, suddenly, without any thinking about what was going to happen or what the consequences might be, we slammed the door shut on migration not only from Mexico, but from the entire Western Hemisphere. Prior to 1965, there were no numerical limits on migration from any country in the Western Hemisphere, and suddenly they were put under strict limitations, which, of course, in the case of Mexico, brought about the continuation of migration under undocumented auspices. Little change between the late 50s and early 60s and the late 60s and early 70s, except that people who used to be circulating with legal documents were now circulating without legal documents. And in response, that began a militarization of the Mexico-U.S. border in an effort to stop the illegal migrants and the rise of a Latino threat narrative that demonized Latino immigrants as a grave threat to the nation because, after all, they're illegal migrants, so therefore, by definition, they're criminals and lawbreakers. And the resulting militarization of the border, a massive increase in enforcement power along the border, did not deter people leaving for the United States from Mexico and then more recently from Central America. What it did was deter them from going home. Once you militarize the border, you dramatically increase the costs of border crossing and the risks of border crossing, and you make it very unpleasant to cross the border. And we transform what had been a circular flow of male workers going into 3 states into a settled population of families living in 50 states as a result of our own militarization of the border. So not only was massive border enforcement, I think, dysfunctional in the context of ongoing economic integration, it proved to be counterproductive and actually ended up doubling the net rate of undocumented population growth and accelerating, increasing the size of the undocumented population in the United States. Finally, I think it's really immoral because the militarization of the border brought about a huge escalation in deaths. There's probably between 5,000 and 6,000 deaths that occurred that wouldn't have occurred in the absence of the militarization. Immigration violations are not criminal offenses for the most part. They're civil crimes. So we're causing the death of people, and we're massively incarcerating people in the immigration detention system for what are essential civil violations of civil, not criminal law. And of course, our border policy is also immoral because of mass deportations that are going on, which end up breaking up families, destroying lives of children, and in point of fact, end up deporting many American citizen children back to Mexico, where they are in fact undocumented in Mexico. There are about, according to estimates from Mexican sources, there are about 300,000 to 400,000 U.S.-born kids in Mexico now who have been deported along with their parents. They have the right to stay in the United States, but they return because their parents have been deported. And they are U.S. citizens by birth, and they will be coming back to the United States, but they won't be coming back with the same kind of education and well-being that they would have enjoyed had they been able to stay in the United States with their families. And the immorality of it is that we are deporting these American citizen kids in de facto terms, and the U.S. embassies and the U.S. consulates in Mexico are doing absolutely nothing to help these vulnerable American citizens in Mexico who are having trouble adjusting to life in Mexico, having trouble gaining access to schooling in Mexico. They don't speak Spanish that well. They don't know American history. And there is no assistance being provided by the U.S. consulates and the U.S. Embassy. And finally, the main refugee flows across the border at this point are Central Americans. And our refugee policy, I think, is unethical and immoral because it's based on political criteria rather than humanitarian criteria. So at this moment, it's easy for Nicaraguans and for Cubans to enter the United States. A Cuban can leave Cuba and go to Mexico, go up to the border and announce to the Border Patrol officer, "Hi, I'm a Cuban," and he will be processed as a refugee and granted an easy path to a green card. A Nicaraguan who was trying to escape the horrendous conditions during the Central American intervention of the United States in the 1980s was granted a red carpet to a green card by the Nicaraguan Adjustment and Refugee Control Act, NICARA Act. And they were given a passport to legal status in the United States. However, Salvadorans, Hondurans, and Guatemalans who were trying to escape the civil wars and the violence and the economic dislocations that were in fact caused by our own political and military intervention in the regions were not granted any passage into the United States. We attempted to exclude them, and as a result, most entered the United States in undocumented status. And the people that are coming today are simply boomerang refugees from our intervention in the 1980s because that region never went back to the status quo ante. It was permanently destabilized. People are escaping conditions in Central America that we ourselves as a nation are responsible for, and we are not providing any safe haven. And we as a country are fully capable of doing so. These are tens of thousands of minors rather than the hundreds of thousands of Southeast Asians who came in the late 70s that were able to process and integrate in the United States without that many problems. So it's really a political decision, and the politics is really driving a moral outrage, in my opinion.
Okay, so now it's Javier Trevino's turn, a professor at CIDE. So please, Javier.
I'm going to talk about migrants in transit in Mexico. And I just started recently my research on this field in the last 2 years. Before that, I was working on human rights abuses and transitional justice and atrocities perpetrated in Mexico during the authoritarian regime. But it became clear recently with more evidence the fact that migrants in transit in Mexico, mainly from Central America, are suffering and that state officials, ordinary Mexicans, and members of the organized crime are perpetrating abuses against these migrants in transit. So that is why I am involved in this field. And I mean, just maybe most of you know what is happening, but just to give you an idea, every year more or less 18,000 migrants are kidnapped in Mexico. And once I'm not talking about detentions, illegal or legal detention, but kidnappings. And once they're in captivity, they're subject to torture, extortion, forced disappearances, sexual abuses, forced labor, and many of them are killed. And according to the UN, Mexico is the country with the highest rate of dead international migrants. And according to some NGOs in Central America, every year at least 20,000 migrants are disappearing in Mexico. And so that is why I got involved in this field. To my surprise, what I found was that this was not sort of an academic issue in Mexico. For example, in Mexico, we have these two important journals, one in international migration and the other one in international relations. And I couldn't find a single article on the subject 3 years ago, at least. And this was not an issue for many members of the international community of human rights either. And this was also a surprise for me. And this was not an issue for the International Community of Human Rights because according to the official discourse, these were not violations of human rights. Well, to begin with, these things were not happening, right? Like, so torture never happened, migrants were not disappearing, and so on. And then with more evidence, the official argument was, well, maybe these things are happening, but these are, members of the organized crime killing each other and so on. So these are not human rights violations because the state is not involved. But of course, you cannot understand the disappearance of 20,000 migrants every year in Mexico without the complicity of the authorities. And so the few studies that I found on the subject in Mexico and a few in the United States try to explain what is happening based on some ideas that these people call securitization of the migration policies in Mexico. And more or less the argument goes like this. Mexico now sees migration as a security threat, and therefore the government is investing more money, officials, and practices, and so on and so forth to stop this risk. And there's an important element in this argument. This is not a Mexican thing. It's the US that is behind. So it's like the US is to blame for what is happening. However, most of these authors talking about this securitization of migration policies not always offer evidence to support these, and because of the extent of the abuses and the brutality, maybe we need to find additional explanations to what is happening, not only the securitization of migration policies in Mexico. For example, most immigration laws in Mexico link security and immigration, but this link has been there for the last 200 years. It's not like something that just like after 9/11 the US imposed. This link has been there for a while. Also, one of the argument was like, now in Mexico you can find filters and checkpoints in airports, in highways, and these people are chasing migrants. Yes, they are, but these provisions in the law have been there for the last 40 years. It's not something that is new or imposed recently. And finally, when you talk about securitization, you need like sort of a discourse, like to portray migrants as a threat and as a risk to security. And this is what is happening in other countries. But in Mexico, you cannot find the public discourses of the government saying migrants in transit for Central America are at risk to national security. It's not that often. You cannot find it often. Maybe recently, but in the last years, this was not the main discourse. On the contrary, what you find is like we are detaining them to protect them. So it is a human rights thing. So what is happening is justified in the name of human rights. So maybe I think, and maybe I'm wrong, if you think about securitization, this implies a process in which the state officials, society, right-thinking people, and so on, or show great concern about immigration and migrants and immigrants who are deemed to be a security threat. However, what I think is happening in Mexico is exactly the opposite process. We don't care about migrants at all. And in a way, they are sort of disposable commodities. You can just get rid of them, and it doesn't really matter. And also, these ideas of securitization cannot explain the increasing participation of ordinary Mexicans in this industry, which is what I found during like these interviews that I carried out in Central America and in Mexico. Now you have like ordinary Mexicans who have never been involved in the organized crime or whatever. Now, like families who made a living from the cultivation of coffee or whatever, but now are getting involved in the process of kidnapping migrants from Central America. And this involved the grandmother, the grandfather, and the whole family, and not only like sort of the process of kidnapping, but also, like taxi drivers, people working in Western Union, people who are asked to pay, $3 for a glass of water in a restaurant, the migrants in transit. So it's ordinary Mexicans, and this cannot be explained by these ideas of securitization. So maybe we have to find an alternative explanation. I don't know. Maybe, I don't know, we can, Hannah can help with this idea of superfluity. This idea of these migrants in transit, their lives are superfluous. They don't matter at all for their lives don't matter in Mexico. And I mean, this is just like my intuition, but I think that we need to find alternative explanations.
Thank you. Good. So should we open the floor for questions, Melissa?
Yes, I think so. Why don't you start on that end?
Okay, so who would like to start? Anyone from the audience? Don't be shy. They're nice people. I spent a year with them. Believe me, they're really nice. Okay, so here we go. Esteban.
I just had a question for Francisco's approach when it comes to the relative weight and the proportionality priority you mentioned. Have you thought of any kind of a table of equivalences or something like that that could help balance the right to a family, or the right to security, or the right to economic freedom, or the right to economic safety, or those kinds of things? And would it have to be, are you talking about personal, like an interpersonal kind of balance that each person would have to make, or you're talking about like intercardinal comparisons of different scales of value used?
So I think we need to increase the volume. Do you mind repeating the question?
De abajo. O el micro está aquí en la ambiental.
Claudio, maybe you can repeat the question.
Yes.
Just if you have thought of any way of weighting the relative importance of different rights, I don't know, maybe it can be easy, family or security, but also economic freedom or economic certainty. How do you plan to weigh or to balance those kind of things?
Thank you. So I really don't think that it's possible to come up with some measure. I think we should kind of into balancing, depending on the specifics of the case. Yes, absolutely. There's no way to quantify, unfortunately, these things in advance. So that's sort of general theory about how the population weight, how much the population depends on.
Maybe not quantify it, but I think his question was, how do you determine the relative priority of different rights? So on the basis of what moral theory do you do that?
Okay, so my point wasn't assuming any theory of the grounds of these rights, but I think that the most promising way to address this kind of conflict is to sort of Cameroonian practice, okay? Which, well, the virtues of this approach is that it's pluralist, so it is capable of including different kinds of consideration, fairness consideration, integrity consideration, autonomy consideration. So that's the approach I would take. But I cannot give any specific answer as to how much we should take.
I would like to ask a question that combines the presentations from Doug and from Javier, if I may, which was, I thought that both of you brought out in a very interesting way that focusing simply on the responsibility of a single state is not going to give us enough purchase on the causes of certain kinds of human rights abuses. So, for example, if we think of the standard, actually a number of also Enrique's presentation also brought this in. For example, if you think of the standard definition of a refugee being the victim of state-sponsored persecution, that doesn't fully capture the situation of the migrants from Central America, in Doug's view, because the U.S. was contributing to the human rights abuses which may be carried out against them either in Mexico while they're in transit and in the United States. So there's not a single state from which they're fleeing, their original state, in whichever Central American state it might be, which is accountable, but rather there's a multiplicity of actors who are contributing to the abuses. And I thought that Javier's point was also very interesting because it was suggesting that it's important that there are human rights abuses in which it's not the state which is the directly culpable actor, although it may be complicit through its negligence or through other means. So I just wondered more broadly if any of the panelists wanted to address this question of the complication of the historical intermeshing of these different patterns of state and non-state responsibility in relation to some of the particular human rights abuses that we see in the course of migration through Mexico and in Mexico and into the United States.
Well, I think that a major flaw in American policy and in policy throughout the region is that we never made any provision for the movement of people within the integrated economies we're taking. If the United States had treated Mexico in the same way that the European Union treated Spain when it brought it into the European Union in the mid-1980s and set up pathways for legal migration into the United States, we would have a tiny undocumented population today, and we would have avoided a lot of the human rights violations that we've seen in the past several years. In fact, we would have had a smaller Latino population in the United States than we observe now, and more people remaining in Mexico. And likewise with CAFTA, but more importantly, our refugee policy ignored the realities on the ground and what was going on in Central America with the Contra intervention, the financing of death squads in Guatemala and El Salvador, the use of Honduras as a staging area, and the violence that resulted from all that caused a massive decline in gross domestic product throughout the frontline states during the 1980s, an absolute decline, not a relative decline. And that's what's driving the people, and we've never even honored our own role in producing these outflows and approached the various states to negotiate reasonable agreements about the movement of refugees and the movement of people within the CAFTA and the NAFTA regions. So I think it has to be a multilateral discussion, a multilateral negotiation, and based in the realities on the ground, which the United States specializes in ignoring.
Okay. Maybe I have to mention that the kind of arguments that I mentioned today entail a view about the philosophy of international relationships that may be very, very controversial. because many philosophers even think that international law doesn't even exist. My view is that these kind of ideas have much more sense if we learn to think about borders as complex special institutions. And the thing is that philosophers tend to have a very simplified idea about borders as lines in the ground. But if you think about borders as complex institution, the special thing about borders is that they have a different scope than the rest of institutions. The scope of these institutions obviously goes beyond. But the thing is that what challenges international law is the idea that there is no global sovereignty to make sense of it. But if you think in borders in this way, you don't need international sovereignty or an international government to make sense of certain duties, legal duties. But what you need is to assess borders from inside with the same kind of assessment, moral assessments about justice and legitimacy that you exercise in the rest of institutions. And this is important because traditionally, border institutions, meaning airports, customs, but also international affairs rules, tend to be governed by what we call reasons of state, and with secrecy and not with openness and clarity. So the idea that lies behind is to bring these institutions to the lack of public assessment. And if you think in these kind of ideas about the philosophy of international law and international relationships, then the idea of a complex view about our duties regarding immigrants makes much more sense. I don't know if that maybe clarifies some of your concerns.
Yes, thank you. Is there another question in Mexico City?
Yes, we have several now. So you want to start?
Yes. My question is for Professor Massey. You're very critical of the U.S. migration policy. To what extent, if any, do you think that the Mexican government is also responsible for this?
Well, Mexico is complicit in some ways, but I put the burden of responsibility on American shoulders. It goes back to the beginnings of NAFTA in 1994, when Carlos Salinas came to the United States and his slogan was, "We want to export goods and not people." And it was perfectly obvious that NAFTA was not going to prevent the movement of people. It was going to probably accelerate the movement of people, which it did. And it created false expectations in the United States and false hopes in Mexico. Apagón allá.
Ya está controlado.
But Mexican government historically has been quite critical of American immigration policy. I think it's more complicit in American drug policy. When Calderon launched a frontal assault on the cartels at the beginning of his sexenio, I think that was a huge mistake, and it really brought violence out into the open, and resulted not only in the victimization of transit migrants through places like Tamaulipas, but really for many Mexican citizens as well. Rural Mexico in particular has changed dramatically in the 35 years that I've been working in Mexico. It used to be very safe and tranquil, and now parts of rural Mexico are much more dangerous than the cities. So the Tierra Caliente de Michoacán and Morelos and Tamaulipas and so on are really dangerous places to be, and that has a lot to do with what the Mexican government did, I think, in trying to curry favor with the United States by acting tough with the cartels. But as with border enforcement, the policy backfired.
Can I say something on that regard? I would like to take up some of the questions that Doug just mentioned. So I would like to make a provocative suggestion and see what people think about this. I think we have to connect the problem of migration with one of the central problems that we're facing in Mexico right now, which you just mentioned, which is the destruction that the cartels are doing in some communities. So in some places in Mexico, we literally have a state of nature situation in which entire communities have been destroyed and people have been forced to actually move out of those communities as a result of the violence issued by the cartels. Now, of course, part of the moral responsibility for that falls on the Mexican government, but also part of it falls in the U.S. in general for two main reasons. I mean, the U.S., it's the place that drives the demand for drugs on the one hand, and on the other hand, the guns that get killed people come from the U.S. So people in these communities that have been completely destroyed, the question is, shouldn't they have a right to automatically move to the U.S. as a sort of reparation for the harm that they have suffered? Now, a colleague of mine, a former student of mine, a colleague of mine who's here in the audience told me, well, that might be a problem because that might give incentives to the narcos to destroy communities and then use these people to smuggle drugs in the U.S. So it goes backfire. I think there are ways to actually take care of that risk. So the proposition wouldn't it be a good ethical way of, repairing the harm by granting an automatic visa to Mexicans from these communities that have been destroyed by the drug violence? I mean, anyone could, weigh in on this. And if no one wants to weigh in on this, we have other people who would like to ask a question.
I think that you would just be assuming that these people would actually want to go to the U.S.
Oh, whether they want to or not, I mean, that would be a valuable resource if they wanted to. I mean, it's possible that they might want to.
Okay.
I don't know.
Just wanted to...
Well, in point of fact, undocumented migration from Mexico is over. It ended 8 years ago and is basically running negative at this point, partly because of the deportations from the United States. But the point remains that very, very few people are leaving Mexico without documents at this point. And Mexico has undergone the demographic transition where its fertility rate fell from about 7 children per woman in the 1960s to around 2.2, 2.3 children per woman today. Mexico is becoming an aging society and is actually beginning to import labor from Central America. A lot of the agricultural work in Mexico is not done by campesinos anymore, but by Central American migrants. So really Mexico is beginning to become a labor-receiving society. I would have no problem in granting a humanitarian visa to someone escaping narco violence in Mexico, but I don't think that's really a solution to many problems at this point. We really need to regularize. The biggest moral compulsion at this point is to regularize the status of the 11 million people in the United States who are currently out of status. If we could regularize those people and give them legal status in the United States, a lot of the problems that we observe along the border would go away, because the Central American people who are arriving and Mexicans who are trying to come in are usually moving to join family members. But there's no way to legally reunite family members if they're out of status. Once they are in legal status, then family reunification laws come into effect and allow processes of family reunification to move forward. So I think that keeping 11 million people in legal limbo and actually increasing the pressure on them on an annual basis through mass deportations is really a crime against humanity.
Do we have a question in the room here? We have a smaller audience, but we may have some questions. Barbara. So
We cannot hear.
We can't hear the question.
Barbara, why don't you come here? You may need to sit here. Sorry, she'll come up to the microphone. Sorry.
Sorry about that. Hi. Okay, so so I have a question about I think for several people in the audience or on the panel about permissible selection. So the category of refugees is sort of the only category that, by definition, and asylum seekers is not selected. I mean, sort of they become candidates for immigration by virtue of their need rather than our wishes to select among them. And I was wondering, so selection didn't come up very much in your talk, Francisco. You talk about restriction instead. But U.S. is not a great example for restriction because, you know, there's 1 million green cards a year, so it really is at, I think, the heart of the problem with U.S.-Mexico immigration is selection. And some of these things Doug has pointed to, like the quota per country, sort of a desire on the U.S.'s part to select for certain countries and certain citizens rather than others. And then within the refugee system, sort of a desire to select certain refugees rather than others. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about that from several of you, especially in light of what Enrique said in the beginning about sort of a cooperative community that exists between the U.S. and Mexico. And so I was wondering whether that would give rise to sort of a reason or sort of grounds for being selective in favor of Mexican immigrants rather than others. And so, for instance, if we cannot let everyone in, you know, do we favor immigrants from Mexico who we have set special obligations to in virtue of the sort of community that exists, versus, let's say, refugees from Syria with whom, let's just stipulate, there is no such relationship and no special obligation. I was just wondering what you have to say about that.
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting question. The thing is that there is not much to do actually, because Mexicans are rather organized as far as I understand, and that's why, as Massey said, the market of workers tends to be very precise in the terms that when jobs are offered, people go, and when jobs are not, people stop to go in very precise ways. But in the more normative area, I think the idea is not that open migration equals chaos in movement of people. I think that the solution about these coordination problems is very familiar. When you open a restaurant, in principle, everyone is welcome. But if everyone came at the same time, then you cannot provide the service to everyone with the same quality. So you make reservations, and the idea of processing immigration requests cleverly involves the idea of making people wait for a turn and try to process immigration selection in terms of need and in terms of space, in terms of the capacity of the state to assimilate and process the immigrants. But this means that in principle, everyone is welcome, that the whole idea is just to wait your turn.
Is there another question there? And then I think we have one more here as well.
Okay, this. You have to come here or
here.
Hi. It's a comment linking several of the comments that have been made here. So thinking of borders as complex institutions, I think it's a very interesting and correct way of seeing them. But also, like, that entails considering the different incentives that might be created in borders and that might conflict and compete with other institutions. So I guess my question would be, if you consider the south border of Mexico and the northern border of Mexico, and Mexico as a transit place, and you consider these two institutions with competing incentives, because you have, as you mentioned, so in Mexico apparently there's been a shift where undocumented migrants are desirable in order to be exploited. a thing that apparently has gone down in the United States. So people don't want, maybe Mexican workers, there's a deterrence. They don't want anybody to come in for several reasons. So we end up with the deterrence on the north and the desirability on the south. And part of the problem comes that people from Central America don't want to come to Mexico. They want to go to the US. So part of the problem that I see is that for the US, the deterrence comes from, I don't know how many reasons, but then you are stuck with the situation in Mexico where, yes, part of the problem and part of the responsibility goes to the Mexican state, but also part of it comes from stopping the possibility of going where they actually want to go. So when you consider the desires of the migrants and where they're stuck, then you have to think of the status of the people who are staying there. And that's where, so taking the question of the last participant, I don't know her name, but the idea of the desirability of the migrants and how do we frame them as refugees, as asylum seekers, or as undocumented migrants. And in that case, you end up blurring the division between political migrants and economic migrants. And I think in that blurring is where we have to think, because when we think of North Central America, it's not just thinking about political refugees or people exposed to violence. It's this complex interaction between violence and poverty that is not different, but it's feeding of one another. So how do we think of the responsibilities of the northern border when this is part of the thing that they're causing?
Francisco? Doug, go ahead.
I think this is symptomatic of a bigger issue that's unfolding in the global economy today. And if you look at the late 20th century and all of the international migration that occurred from developing to the developing world, most of the people who moved were migrating to access opportunities. They were seeking to gain something from migration in order to either improve their lives at home or to relocate and make a new life somewhere else. As the 21st century unfolds, I think we're shifting to a new regime where the main motivation, or at least a growing motivation, is going to be the desire to escape threats rather than a desire to access opportunities. And this creates thorny problems of selection, and it creates a very different selection process than one we observed in the late 20th century. With the rise of global warming, you're going to see more and more people migrating from environmental problems and ecological problems. And these problems will feed into political problems that will be causing states to weaken and sometimes collapse, which will produce other refugees. And of course, with collapsing states and environmental degradation going on, that's a formula for conflict and armed conflict, which again produces people who move. So I think we're just at the beginnings of what's going to be a much larger problem in the 21st century, and we really need to think hard about how we're going to deal with these people, because building walls and simply trying to exclude them is not going to work. I think I came to have a grudging admiration for Angela Merkel in Germany for hanging tough and really against considerable opposition, saying that we're going to take these people in and give and integrate them as refugees and asylum seekers. The United States is doing virtually nothing on the global front, much less in our own backyard. So this is going to be a serious problem for the 21st century, and we're only beginning to come to grips with it.
I wanted to just follow up before we have another question here, but so how do you relate the pressures that you were speaking about from the integrated labor markets with these sort of pressures from a broader, these threat pressures, and then there were the family reunification concerns. So how, what sort of, what sort of flows do each of those categories account for, broadly speaking, now?
Well, in the United States, the vast majority of people enter through family reunification provisions and permanent residence through family reunification provisions. A very small number actually come in as official refugees, and a small but significant part come in as labor migrants to satisfy labor needs. There are a lot of problems with the U.S. system. We have a pretty good guest worker program going on right now. From Mexico alone, there are about 350 to 400,000 guest worker entries every year with various kinds of visas, not just agricultural workers, but all kinds of people that are moving back and forth within the integrated North American economy. And the problem is, with most of these visas, you get 2-3 year periods, and then you have to either become a just status to permanent residence, but there you're running into numerical caps, which really creates a problem. It's really kind of a stupid policy because you integrate people in the U.S. labor market for 6 years and then throw them out. It makes no sense whatsoever. We really don't deal with refugees at all. And in the past, we've dealt with them on an ad hoc basis. So most of the Indo-Chinese refugees who came in didn't come in through a managed, organized system. They came in, they were paroled in by the Attorney General outside the quotas, outside the regular immigration system, as were the Cubans, really as were the Nicaraguans. So we really need to make refugee policy a permanent part of immigration policy, and have a flexible policy that can adapt to the different needs, because these refugee flows occur quite suddenly, and we're totally unprepared for them. We have to be prepared for these in the future because they're going to continue to happen, and you need a flexible immigration policy, not one that says, oh, we'll take 20,000 every year. That's just not going to work in the future.
Thank you. May we go on with one more question from here? Another graduate student, Lucia.
Hi.
Hi.
So this question is most directly for Enrique, I think, although there's a version of it that I guess could apply to everyone. So I'm sort of wondering, so I take it one of the things you're trying to say is that we have these sort of role-based or associative obligations, and part of discharging them is at least talking about having more sort of open borders, more open than they are now. And so I'm wondering why it is that you think sort of migration is the sort of way to solve the problem. So if you think that, we're involved in these sort of economic and social and political relationships with people across borders, that might generate all kinds of duties toward them. And it seems like, there might be all kinds of things that those duties entail, maybe transferring resources, maybe sort of having just regulations over trade or something like that. So I'm wondering if you think there's something special about migration that means we should sort of, answer the challenge by opening borders. And I mean, maybe the answer is just that that's what people want, or maybe it's that having integrated trade, as you were saying, is just going to encourage, integrated sort of population flows, or maybe it has something to do with the moral character of the liberal democracy, which is sort of that kind of thing. So just curious to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, very good question. I think what's special about this train of arguments is that we all have general duties of assistance, and you have a moral right to be helped. So if you need, for instance, an organ transplant, you have a moral right to get assistance, but you don't have a moral right against Claudio to give away an organ for you, for instance. So the thing is that these duties are never per se particularized. The whole point is that they get particularized not only by means of consent, but also by means of participating in certain cooperative relationships. And the whole idea is that if liberal states, liberal democracies have this kind of moral character that entails them with this kind of status, moral status, then maybe their duties are also depicted by the idea of associative duties as the duties of individuals. So if we have this kind of cooperative history, shared history in North America with our three countries, maybe some of the duties for helping other people, Samaritan duties, get particularized in the way that if the children from your neighbor is in peril, is walking alone in the neighborhood, then you have to take him in. You have to provide for them. And the thing is that with the current situation, children traveling alone from the rest of Latin America, for instance, they get processed, and sometimes they even get allowed to ask for refugee status, whereas Mexican children, as they are the neighbors, they just get turned back because they could be easily deported because of the distances. Obviously, the law says that the same case should work for Canada, but effectively, Canadian children are not traveling alone in the neighborhood, but Mexican children are. And obviously, these kind of duties also are present for Mexico. Obviously, Mexico discharges poorly its own duties regarding Central American and other immigrants traveling through Mexico. I think that that's another attractive of my view. Thank you.
Can we do another question from our end? Yeah?
Yes, please.
Carlos.
You are back. So I'm trying to put together like a train of thought regarding things that have been said in the table. But I mean, when I was driving here, I was thinking about like, it's interesting to think about migration from an ethical standpoint. And you know, for a long time, Mexico had this sort of moral high ground in regards to the U.S. You know, in its complaints or in its demands on how Mexican migrants were treated there. But I don't know if in the more recently, Mexico has lost that moral high ground because of the way Mexico treats Central American migrants, right? But, and you know, in the public discourse, there is this complaint about Mexican hypocrisy, or the Mexican double discourse regarding migration. With on the one hand, you still have Mexicans complaining about the way Americans treat Mexican migrants, but on the other way, you have Mexicans treating very poorly or even worse Central American migrants. So, if migration is a sort of phenomenon in regards to which we can think of ethical complaints or ethical demands to be formulated to states, and we want to introduce a consideration regarding the push factors for migration. As Douglas Massey was saying, you know, he puts the burden of responsibility on American shoulders, even though Mexico has its own, you know, responsibilities as well. Shouldn't we also be thinking about, you know, significant distinctions to be made in regards to the ethical demands we formulate to a country like the U.S. and the ethical demands we formulate in regards to a country like Mexico? That's my question.
It's an interesting point, the one that Mexico might have lost, the moral high ground. The thing is that I believe that the demands and the claims being made here can be interpreted as being made by individuals or suffering limitations on the rights. So the fact that the state might have lost the moral high ground need not imply that individuals lose any kind of strength in their claims.
Any other question around here?
I'd just like to point out that it's already bigger than simply Central Americans coming through Mexico. I was in Tijuana about a month ago and went to a Casa de Migrante there, and 95% of the people were Haitian. And there is a growing population of Haitians. They migrated to Brazil as laborers during the Brazilian economic boom and all the construction for the Olympics and all the construction for the World Cup. And now Brazilian economy's gone downhill, and they're not welcome, and they're making their way through Central America up through Mexico and getting stuck on the border. And we're seeing, and the U.S., which used to process the Haitians if they made it to the border, a couple of weeks ago basically stopped doing so. And so now there's going to be a growing population of Haitians in Mexico. And I think this is a harbinger of things to come, not just in this hemisphere, but around the world. We just saw the French tear down the so-called jungle in Calais, and this is the future. And we really need to think hard and develop some policies before these emergencies happen in a consensual way to take care of them. But of course, I'm speaking here in the land of Donald Trump, and I have a white nationalist reaction against the demographic changes and against immigrants in the United States. So it's a very difficult and thorny problem.
I can, yes.
Just get closer.
It's very quick point and consideration regarding the complexity of claims making and moral standing on the basis of what appears to me to be a fiction, and it's usually brought out in a discussion like this, and it hasn't been here, although I'm pretty sure everyone will agree. It is a fiction that the community of migrants that has a right to make a claim, either in the US or in Mexico, is external to the political community, right? We know for a fact that in the United States there are 11 million undocumented migrants already, and they have 4 million US citizen children. So that means that they're not really migrants as individuals standing at a remove from the political community, but rather woven in already. And that's only one dimension of it, right? Part of the problem stemming from the immigration consequences of criminal activity, these series of reforms enacted in the 90s that make it a special kind of crime to commit series of basically basic criminal activities like smoking pot or driving under the influence as activities that subject you to an immigration penalty if you're a migrant, even if you are in good standing, have consequences. And they have consequences in relation to the deportation regime, because what we are seeing in Central America and in Mexico is that the people going back, trying to come back into the community and being imprisoned for up to 18 months or 24 months, are people that were in the political community and were deported because they drove drunk or smoked pot or beat someone, right? So again, the basic point is that they're not external to the political community. Their standing can be made there. And from that perspective, the question of whether and how there's a difference between the states, the United States, where the people with a right or moral standing to make the claims are much broader than they are in Mexico, and the type of claims that they can make on the basis of their basic integration or interwovenness within the community is different. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you. Do you have more questions? Okay.
Well, I agree completely. It is worse than you put it. A lot of people think that the only groups that are getting deported are undocumented migrants, but lots of legal immigrants are getting deported as well. Because in 1996, in the charmingly titled Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, the U.S. Congress stripped away virtually all civil rights from not only undocumented migrants, but for any non-citizen. So people who've lived here in legal status for 20 years can get a DWI and be deported. And the other thing that's happened is the 1996 legislation and also the 2001 Patriot Act criminalized a lot of things about the migration process. And so when Obama gets up and talks loftily about only deporting criminal aliens, really many of those people have been criminalized through laws passed in the last 15 years. Criminalizing things that used to be civil penalties. So being apprehended multiple times used to be a civil penalty, and there was no. But now, if they can prove that you've been apprehended 3 times, I think it becomes a felony. And then once it's a felony, you're excludable permanently from the United States. So the law has become more and more and more unforgiving, not only to undocumented migrants, but also to any non-citizen in the United States.
So I think these are very powerful and important points. It seems we're coming towards the end of the discussion here. I don't know if there's one remaining question there. We don't have any more people waiting to ask questions here.
I think we're in the same situation.
I know it's much later, or a little bit later there. Oh, sorry, earlier. Yes.
Earlier, yes. But the panelists have been so convincing and eloquent that everybody's convinced. So.
Of course, it's earlier. I'm sorry. We would like to say, how much we appreciate everyone's willingness to contribute to this conversation. It seemed something that was important to do, to realize that these are complex questions for both the U.S. and for Mexico and for other countries in the region, from all of which are involved with sending and receiving and problems of injustice in transit and in hosting people and in deportations. And so we thought it was very important to share perspectives on some of those questions, and we really value everyone's time in sharing this conversation at a distance. So that would be my closing word. Please, Claudio, also share your thoughts.
Thank you, Melissa. Well, I really don't have much to add. You put it beautifully. I just want to thank the Center for Human Values for creating this bridge with us, and I really think that doing more of these things will contribute to keeping our communities, academic or otherwise, in both sides of the border communicated. So let's do it again, and thank you very much.
Thank you
very much. And hi to everybody there.
Y hoy me gustaría saludar a todos mis amigos y colegas en CIVE, en el bonito barrio de Santa Fe, en Finlandia.
Gracias, saludos allá.
Adiós, gracias a todos.